So for the next step, let's look at some tools that will help us more manually add to our scattering system. So first up, let's have a look at the clone stamp tool, the clone stamp 3D tool rather. So what this allows us to do is we can plug in some source objects. So again, let's plug in our scatter geometry, so the box sphere and cylinder. And what we can do basically is click anywhere on the screen and one of the objects from the source list will appear. So this is great when you want to add a single instance of an object to flesh out your scene. The selection you have here though is that you can, for example, you can select the geometry group. So if you want your stamps to only apply to, say, for example, the cylinder, we can select that, and whatever we click, even though here it looks like I'm clicking on the plane, it's only applied on the cylinder, so that is quite useful. Let's just disable that for now. Another thing we can do is select our cloning mode. So currently it creates instances. We can instead create copies. So what are instances and what are copies? Instances is a type of a copy of an object which directly uses the original to not have to load in the geometry itself. So it's actually quite good for saving your memory, because if you create copies instead, then these are actual separate objects that each have to be calculated separately. And as you can see here, compared to the instances, they're defined by the lack of the little eye in the corner of the icon. So I recommend using instances because they take up less memory. Some of the other settings on offer here are our abilities to snap the surface. So wait, let me disable this just for ease of seeing what I'm doing. So for example, I can align to normal, and basically when I'll be creating an object, it's aligned to the normal of whatever I'm putting it on. So again, quite useful, especially if you are painting, say, foliage on a landscape. Another thing we can check is snap default plane. So currently, whatever I'm doing is snapped onto the plane going horizontally because it's X and Z. Instead, for example, I can do Y and Z. And this way, it will be snapped to the plane along the YZ horizon. So that's quite useful and worth remembering. And the last things we can do is, for example, add in some scatter variants. So I often recommend adding in 360 degrees for any kind of plants or foliage, and so any object you paste is going to be randomly rotated. And again, the rotation step and the rotation variants are exactly the same as I have previously described. Again, you can add a little bit of translation variance. So for example, if I add 10 here, your object will be translated a random value between 0 and 10 in the y-axis. So again, quite useful. And uniform scaling variance, if I add in 100%, and let's just cancel this out, you can see that we get a little bit of variance in the scale as well. And so that's really all for the Clone Stamp 3D tool. It's very useful for adding individual bespoke objects to kind of flesh out your scene, and I would recommend using it after you've done your main scattering, just to get the nice finishing touches. Okay, so next up is our particle paint tool, and this is really cool. So let's turn this off, and let me delete all of the objects created by the Clone Stamp 3D. So all of these. Delete, and let's have a look at our previous scatter again. Actually, no, yeah, let's turn it off. So with the particle paint, again, double click here to go into its settings. Let's enlarge this. So there are several different settings that are quite important. So the essential idea of it is that you create a new object here. You click New, Geometry, and Container. And this will be the container for all of the particles that you now paint. So if I draw a stroke here, you can see that I've just drawn a bunch of particles on the geometry. And by default, they stick to all of the geometry available. So I can paint on anything that I want in my scene. If I so decide, in the geometry group here, I can just select, again, a single object, and I can just paint on that, and it won't paint on the plane that I have here. However, again, by default, it is set to paint on a plane, in this case, the XZ plane. So we can disable this by here selecting None, and so now I can just paint on the cylinder itself and nothing else will be affected, and that is quite cool and very useful. So what are the different settings available here in the paint mode? So for example, we have either sketch or stamp. So sketch, as you can see, let me disable this so you can paint on everything. Sketch just allows me to sketch, and stamp allows me to select where I want to stamp a specific group of particles, and then I release and they stamp there. It will not paint as I drag the cursor. So let's select sketch again, and here we have several different tool types. There's airbrush, there's paintbrush, and there's eraser. So airbrush, basically we can keep adding more and more particles in one spot, and so you can see here in the middle I've added a lot more than on the edges, and it stacks on top of itself and kind of creates more particles than initially available. Whereas if we select paintbrush, we can brush as much as we want, but it will not affect the density, so it is very good for keeping the number of particles that we have even. Say if you're painting trees in a forest, you don't have to worry about accidentally going over the same spot twice and creating a very dense area. Otherwise, we can use the eraser, and this, as you might guess, allows us to erase certain particles. So this is also extremely useful if, for example, you want to get rid of a specific object that has been scattered that is in the way of your shot, or that is otherwise not what you want. So really cool. Let's just go back into the airbrush. And actually, let's get rid of all of these points that I've painted already. So the brush size, the brush density, and the brush fallout can be controlled here. So for example, I can decrease the size to a very small one, or increase it back up to a very large one. And density is how many points appear within your brush. So for example, we can have a lot, or if I set it to 1, we barely have any. And so let's set this to maybe 50. Brush fall off is essentially kind of the softness of your brush as you paint. So again, it affects how spread out your points are. So instead of having to change these values here, what you can do is hold down the middle mouse button, and then as you drag, it increases and decreases the size. Or you can control the fall off by holding down Control and the middle mouse button, and as you can see here, I'm controlling the softness of the brush. Or I can hold down Shift and use the middle mouse button and increase and decrease the density. So that's really cool and really useful to know, and really speeds up the process. If we go down to particle properties, there are some more basic things to know. And again, I'm only explaining the basics of what is needed to create the artwork that I have created, but they should be sufficient for most projects. So you can of course click surface normal, and now whatever you paint, the particles will follow the surface normal. So let's just, well, first of all, let's decrease density. And so now I've painted some particles. If I go back into my scatterer, I can go into the geometry support and instead change it to my container. So as you can see, if I have the surface normals unclicked and I paint, you have to have the container selected to paint, sorry. None of the normals are followed of the base geometry that we're using, or if we click it, then our geometry follows the surface normal. So that is quite useful. Again, it depends on what you're doing and whether you want that or not. The last thing to discuss in this tool is the stroke ID setting, as well as the idea of it. So basically what it allows us to do is personalize, say, specific strokes of our particle paint tool to provide different properties within the objects that are being scattered. So for example, we can, in our container here, if we select this, we can create a new property, and let's call this stroke ID. And what we want this to be is an integer with a size of 1. So basically, integer is a number such as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we want the size to be 1 because we only want one of these numbers, as opposed to, say, if we wanted 3, that would be 4 if we want a number that can fit into the x, y, z values, so we want 3 numbers. But for this we just want 1. We click OK. And what we can do is, if we go to our material editor and look at our scatterer, in the scatter input we currently have our fractal noise. But if you remember, I previously mentioned this idea of using, instead of luminance, an ID. So let's use the ID. Let's disconnect this fractal noise that I had here, and let's give these geometries an ID. So currently they're all 0. Let's keep box at 0. Let's change sphere to 1 and cylinder to 2. So now they all have different IDs. And in the material editor, let's create a node called extract property. So texture extract property. And in this, we can select property name. And if we click the little, magnifying glass, and select stroke ID, which is the property we've just created, and plug it into the scatter input, basically now we can determine what kind of object gets created when we paint. So here, let's go enable this, and we want to go to the container and select stroke ID. So when this shows 0, I can just paint and everything will be a box, because that was the object with the ID of 0. If I click 1 and I paint now, everything is a sphere. If I select 2 and I paint now, everything is a cylinder. So this gives us quite a lot of control in terms of what we do, and you can have any number of these. Similarly, we can, for example, create a new property and call this scale. And what we want this is to be is a float. So a float is a number that is, for example, 1.1 or 1.5, as opposed to integers, which are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that kind of thing. So size of 3, because we have 3 axes, x, y, and z, which can be within scale, or which scale can be, I guess, within, and click OK. And so now we go back to the material editor where we still have the scatterer. And if I just take this extract property and I Control-C, Control-V, copy and paste it, and plug it into the scatter scale, and in the extract property we select property name scale. So currently, as you see, everything is 0 because nothing has been entered, but here, if I make sure that the value of 1, 1, and 1 is entered here, I can click this button, which allows me to set value for selected properties, and now everything is of size 1. So now, whenever I paint, if I go in the container, I select scale, and say 1, 1, 1, everything I paint will be of scale 1. But if I say set this to 5, the objects I paint will be bigger. So that can be quite useful. And that more or less wraps up the property paint or the particle paint tool. Next up, let's look into the property paint tool and how these two tie together. Okay, so let's click here. And we can see that there are a lot of settings that we're already familiar with. We can set the brush size, the brush strength, the brush fall off. They all work exactly the same way as in the particle paint tool. So, we can adjust these parameters with our middle mouse button and Control and Shift just like that. So the cool things though are that here in the property tab we can select the name of our setting that we would like to adjust and actually change the attributes of pre-existing scattered objects. So for example, if we go to the action setting here, we can choose between set, add, multiply, and erase. So for now, let's select add. And here we have 0, 1, 0, so it'll add 1 to the y value. And if we paint here, we can see that we are adding 1 each time we click on these cylinders, or rather on the particles that generate these cylinders. If I add 1 to everything, you can see that they're getting bigger in all axes. If instead I choose to set and click, the scale of these objects is set to 1. So if I change this to 2, 2, 2, you can see that they're set now to be scale 2, but I can't click more and adjust this. If I select to multiply and again say enter here 2, each time I click this will be multiplied by 2, so it increases very rapidly in terms of scale here. Otherwise I can select my stroke ID here, and basically as you can see this is an integer, so it's a single number. If I paint 0, and also make sure you have the action set to set, otherwise if I do add it doesn't work. So if I have it on set and as I paint 0, the objects become boxes because that is the object with the ID of 0. If I select 1, I can change my objects to spheres, and likewise 2, I can change them to cylinders, so that is quite useful. The last thing to talk about with regards to scatterers for this tutorial will be the action of baking scatterers. So let's take what we have here and let's just select our scatterer, and if we go to the scattering tab up here and click this icon, it bakes a scatterer, so a bake scatterer. And so now we have a copy of our scatterer that is baked. So let me disable this one with Control D. And here we have a copy that I can't add any more points to or any other geometries. However, it is very good because I can, for example, now take this and copy it, and I can sort of use this as an object, and it is very editable. So I do this a lot whenever, say, I'm building a city and I have a block of a city that I've worked out, and then I bake it, maybe adjust some scales, and I can copy and paste it wherever I want, and it's really cool. So it's even more versatile than using the particle container on a non-baked scatterer, because if we go in and click on baked point cloud, we have access to baked IDs, baked rotation, and baked scaling. So here again we can use our particle paint tool, and if you look at baked IDs, if I change anything, these can be changed between the geometries that actually were used in the scatterer. Again, I can go into baked scaling and adjust this. So, sorry, should change that to 2 and all. So that's quite useful again. And also I can access baked rotation. And if I here select, let's do world vector, orientation, and say enter 15 degrees here and leave this at 0 and change to add. Oh, change that again. I can actually rotate the instances that I've scattered. So that is really cool. So that pretty much wraps up the introduction to scattering and all of the sort of basic techniques that I use and I recommend using. And we'll be using these a lot throughout the rest of the project, and I'll revisit them and try to explain them as I go along again, but I thought it would be a good idea to provide this initial explanation of all the techniques so that you have a good understanding once we begin. Okay, so that's it.